Hello and welcome to the Wake Up Call podcast. In this episode, recorded on June 6, 2015, Daniel and I spoke with Dr. Mark Thornton about his article, The Meaning of Financial Repression. Dr. Thornton is Senior Fellow at the Mises Institute and is the book review editor of the Quarterly Journal of Austrian Economics. He has served on the faculty at Auburn University and is the author of The Economics of Prohibition, Terrorist Blockades and Inflation, The Quotable Mises, and the Bastiat collection. You can follow his work on Twitter at Dr. Mark Thornton, on the Mises Institute's Facebook page, and on the Mises Institute's website, mises.org. That's MISES.org. For more information, please see the show notes page for this episode at wakeupcallpodcast.com/financial-repression. So, Dr. Thornton, welcome back to the show.
Hi, Adam. Hi, Daniel. It's great to be back on your program again.
Well, thank you for joining us again. So let's just get started. What is financial repression, and where does this term come from?
Well, it's a very good question. I was recently asked about financial repression, and to tell you the truth, I hadn't heard of it or didn't remember it because it's originally a term from the 1970s that referred to third world dictators and how they would use the financial system to extract resources, money, and wealth from the citizens. But more recently, it's being applied to the leading developed economies of the world, the United States, Europe, Japan, and China, to refer to the same set of policies that modern democracies are using to extract resources from the population, and basically in order to benefit government itself, the big banks, and the very large corporations. And basically it's financial engineering that makes all of us have a lower standard of living and transfers that wealth to the big banks, corporations, and to the government.
So what are some of the methods of financial repression that are being used today?
Well, there's a variety of different methods that are being used. The most notable ones are the zero interest rate policy that the U.S., the European Central Bank, and Japan is using, keeping interest rates low so that governments can borrow at ultra low interest rates, and so that banks have easy access to almost zero interest rate money. The other notable one is quantitative easing, we've heard so much about, whereby the Federal Reserve buys government bonds from banks so that banks make, basically free money on that. And also, in addition to zero interest rate policy and quantitative easing, there's also other means with which the government is creating this financial repression. For example, the U.S. requires banks to hold government bonds as part of their capital requirements. So banks have to hold government bonds as a matter of law, and this, of course, increases the demand for government bonds so that governments can have easy access to credit, and requires banks to have high reserve requirements, and the Fed does this by paying banks interest rate for the excess reserves that are held at the Fed. And then there's also capital controls which make it more difficult for example, Americans to move their money offshore into other economies. And if you wanted to move your money offshore and into another economy today, you would basically have to pay a very large tax to the U.S. government. So the U.S. government is not only taxing its citizens, it's taxing its citizens that want to leave the country. There's a record number of people who are renouncing their U.S. citizenship. And then, of course, the government has also required other countries to collect taxes on American citizens and their assets abroad. And then, of course, the war on cash. So this is a multifaceted war on the population by the governments of the world, notably the U.S. is the worst, and the central banks.
So let's go into two of them individually, and we'll try to get to all of those that you just mentioned. But when you were talking about quantitative easing and zero interest rate policies, you described it as free money. So what's the downside, right? Everyone likes free money. Who are the people who are losing the most from these policies?
Well, it's a very good question. This is where the repression part comes. So the central bank is willing to lend the big banks money at approximately 0.16 of 1%. So this is like if you were a bakery and the government provided you with free flour, eggs, sugar, etc., you could make money easily. But let's look what happens to the average citizen. If banks can borrow at that low rate, why would they pay the depositors any interest on their deposits? And so when I go down to my bank, they're advertising a certificate of deposit, a CD, a 5-year CD at 0.2 of 1%. So it's slightly above what the Fed is willing to lend the big banks. But of course, that's nothing. That's, over 5 years, you're only going to earn a few dollars of interest on a $1,000 CD. And so when I put money in the bank, after inflation, I'm actually losing money because inflation, as the government tells us, is at least 2%. And so I put money in 0.2%, and then when I take it back out, it's lost more than 2% purchasing power every year. And so that's where the hurt really comes into play, is that saving, which is the fountain of wealth and prosperity in our standard of living, is being greatly discouraged. And the people who rely on saving, like you and me, we're not really too concerned about saving per se for ourselves. But what if you're in retirement or near retirement, or you're on a fixed income and you're relying on a safe return on your money? You just can't get it anymore in the American economy because savings accounts, CDs, money market mutual funds, and interest-earning checking accounts basically return nothing. And so that this financial repression is crushing certain elements of the American population.
So how does the war on cash play into this financial repression? And what do the financial and political classes hope to gain from instituting a war on cash?
Well, it's a very good question. I mean, cash is the fountain of our civilization. It's very important for the economy. It's absolutely critical for poor people who don't have the ability to transact electronically and with credit cards and debit cards. But what the government and the central banks are up to, and this is not just a U.S. phenomenon, but it's around the world, where these institutions that are supposed to be working for us are greatly discouraging cash. And so in some countries, the Nordic countries, for example, almost all transactions now are in cash, in electronic transactions. And so what they want to do is take out this element where people can make private transactions. They want everything electronic and traceable. They want to destroy our privacy. And of course, they bring up things like, drug dealers use cash and, illegal transactions. But, what they're really trying to do is suppress cash and privacy and to try to make everything a taxable event. And so this is, again, the government coming in and repressing the private productive economy in the hopes and in actual fact hurting that productive economy, and as a way of transferring wealth to the government and to the politically favored classes such as the big banks and the large corporations.
So in your article, you mention a term, macroprudential policy. I've never heard that term before, and I'm sure some of our listeners haven't either. What is macroprudential policy?
Well, it's a great question. It's a relatively new term, the egghead academic term for a variety of different policies. And basically, macroprudential policies is where the government and the central banks and the whole regulatory apparatus is managing everything that we do. And in particular, the big banks, the banking system, the financial system, where they're tightly regulating everything that's done. And basically, macroprudential policy has the aim of preventing a systemic problem in the economy, precisely because they've created an environment where the economy is very fragile, where certain events could, in essence, bring down the entire financial system. And so a lot of these macroprudential policies, and you can think here in terms of like Dodd-Frank regulation, where everything the banks do has to pass a regulatory test. And I've just learned recently that not only has all of these regulations about what banks can do, who they can lend to, who they must lend to, what reserve requirements they have, what capital requirements they may have. Now, the government is actually putting regulatory lawyers inside the big banks, so that the big banks actually have to provide office space for government regulators so that they can be there to oversee board meetings, lending decisions, everything that's going on has to have the direct oversight of federal regulators. And when I was a state regulator in the banking industry, we sent out people to audit banks and to check on them every once in a while. But we certainly didn't have regulators inside the big banks overseeing their meetings and their lending decisions. And so all of these macroprudential policies in and of themselves don't make any sense, at least to me and to old-time bankers. They just don't make any sense. But as a holistic system, given the situation that we're in, the complexity of the problems that we're dealing with, and let's face it, we're living in a world that has been turned upside down with respect to the macroeconomy. We've got an intense monetary pumping in the economy. We've got a labor market that on the surface looks okay. The unemployment rate is near normal, and yet we have a record number of people who would otherwise be eligible for a job who don't have jobs. And we have, stock market at all-time highs, but economic growth that's at basically zero. And then we've got crazy things like negative interest rates on government bonds in some countries. So these macroprudential policies are, in a sense, trying to manage this whole crazy system, and it just doesn't make any sense.
To follow up on your point about negative interest rates, in your article you refer to this as a nearly unfathomable phenomenon. Can you talk a little bit more about negative interest rates and how we got to where these exist?
Sure, Adam. The concept of negative interest rates in a free market economy is non-existent. They just wouldn't exist. You'd never have a situation where you would deposit money at one point in time, and then a year from now, you withdraw all of your money and you actually have less money. That's what negative interest rates imply. So that would never, ever happen in the free market economy, because people would just put their money in some other form, or just keep it in the form of cash. And so in a free market economy, you'd never, ever get negative interest rates. So how do we have negative interest rates today? Well, it's basically negative interest rates on government bonds. Right now it's 2-year government bonds in certain countries like Switzerland. Well, if you look at the macro picture, if you've got a lot of money, you've got to keep it in the bank. You can't keep it in your mattress. So if you're somebody with $50 million in cash money, basically, not physical assets or financial assets, and you don't want to put them in physical or financial assets because you're worried. Well, you also should be worried about putting the money in the bank, because if banks go bankrupt today, many jurisdictions have put in bail-in provisions into their banking system, so that if a systemically risky bank goes bankrupt, instead of the taxpayers bailing out the depositors, now the depositors, in essence, bail out the bank. So, like in Cyprus a couple of years ago, when the big banks went bankrupt, the banking system, or the government of Cyprus, paid off the depositors on insured amounts in their accounts. But for the large accounts that weren't uninsured, they received what central bankers call a haircut, which basically means you lose a certain percentage of your deposits to the bank. And in some of these bail-in provisions, basically your deposits are converted into stock in the bank. So you lose your money and you get stock in this bankrupt bank. And so with that in mind, big depositors are fearful of these large deposits. And so they want to convert them into government bonds because they feel like the governments themselves are more reliable in paying back their bonds than the banks are in terms of paying back their deposits. And so these large depositors have turned away from bank deposits into government bonds. And then the second factor that comes into play here is that certain currencies, of course the currencies are fluctuating all over the place, so that people might expect the value of a Swiss franc to rise in value, whereas people might also expect the euro to fall in value. So if you're in the European Union with euros, you may decide to take those euros and to convert them into Swiss government bonds, which you feel will appreciate in value because the Swiss franc would appreciate in value. And so with all this monetary manipulation, this financial repression, they've actually forced money into these reliable government bonds, and that's driven down the interest rate to zero and now into negative territory.
So for the average citizen who isn't filled with money and doesn't have to worry about too many of those issues, where can they find yield? Because earlier you were talking about how after inflation, most of the time you're losing money on just the CDs in your bank account. So how can people protect their purchasing power while still maintaining some form of liquidity and being able to take that cash out?
Well, I don't really see any possibilities out there. I mean, of course, I'm not a financial analyst or a money manager, but when I look out there, I can see the fact that a lot of these people saving for retirement or in retirement, they've taken advantage of the rising stock market and put a lot of their money into dividend earning stocks, stocks like consumer goods producers that are relatively stable and have increased in value and are increasing their dividends. But at this point, the stock market has been driven up to extremely high levels, and so I certainly wouldn't recommend that avenue at this point. You know, maybe 5 years ago, that would have been the way to go. And if we end up in a hyperinflation, of course, stocks are the only thing that really maintain their value, at least in a relative sense. So they may not be maintaining their inflation-adjusted value, but they're going to do better than cash, and they're going to do better than bonds. And so there's not a lot of good ways out there that I can see where you can maintain your wealth, where you can get a yield on your wealth in terms of dividends or interest that are not very, very risky. And that's what financial repression is all about, is by taking away avenues by which we can acquire wealth, build wealth, maintain wealth, and earn interest or dividends on that wealth. And that's why they, set the zero interest rate policy and are so reluctant to go off of it. That's why they have a war on cash. That's why they tightened regulations on the banking system. That's why they've been engaged in quantitative easing, is for the benefit of the government itself. So, Congress can spend wildly and run massive deficits without even bother to engaging in any kind of budget debate. And this is helping the very large corporations and their stock prices and their CEOs. And this, of course, has helped banks and driven away the competitors for banks. And so that's the ultimate end game for this worldwide financial repression, war on cash, and world currency war. And I'm afraid it doesn't leave much room for the average person. Of course, I always advocate that everybody have some gold and silver as a protection against inflation and as a hedge in their overall wealth portfolio. Things that will be useful, things that they already need, like real estate, housing, etc. But all of these things are at risk in this crazy, zany, upside-down world of financial repression.
And of course, financial repression, as you point out in your article, helps the government finance its debt, and it helps the government finance more wars and more spying programs and all sorts of nefarious activities, we could say. So where do you think all of this is headed? What do you think all of this means moving forward?
Well, it's a good question. Defense spending has actually slowed down a little bit, but of course they're doing everything possible to increase the demand for that by saber rattling around the world. The spy budgets, of course, are crazy, zany across the board. We're spending a huge amount on spying. It's become a tremendous expense for the government. And I just feel like the people who are in control of our government now basically have no regard for morally carrying out their duties and responsibilities. They don't seem the least bit concerned about the average American. And on the positive side, I see a tremendous ideological surge against these types of policies. And for example, Senator Rand Paul from Kentucky and a few others, tried to stop this and at least somewhat. And I can tell you, I have lots of friends and relatives, and ideologically they're spread across the entire spectrum, from socialist to anarchist and everything in between. And basically, they all came together in support of Rand Paul. And many of those same people were people who really didn't like Senator Paul and his other positions. But on this position, they said, yeah, he's doing the right thing, and I like that. And so what I'm hopeful for here is for that ideological surge to continue. And who knows where that's going to go in the future. But I'm very gratified that this is starting to happen, because what's actually going on in the world, in the world governments and the world central banks, is very dangerous. It's highly destructive. It's really breaking down the fabric of society. So it's great to see people revolting and rebelling and reacting to that in a very strong way. And, I think that going forward, that's going to be a positive element for positive change. And I think, podcasts like what you guys are doing are great, and they're helpful, and they're really essential for making that blossom out, because it's, if it's just person-to-person contact and getting the information, understanding the situation, that takes a lot of time, and it doesn't necessarily work all that well. But when it gets into the media, the alternative media is the other media as a positive engine for ideological change.
Okay, I think we're going to have to wrap up here, but I'd like to mention where this article is for all of our listeners. So if you go to Mises.org/library/meeting-financial-repression, you will find this article. It's a great article, and I encourage all of the listeners to go and listen and read it. And one final question for you, Dr. Thornton. How can our listeners follow your work?
Well, the best place is mises.org. This is a Mises daily article. Daily articles that appear on our site. We also have a Mises Weekend podcast this week featuring one of our summer research fellows from France. I think you're going to find that great. It's a great program. And you can follow me on Twitter at Dr. Mark Thornton. And of course, the Mises Institute has a Facebook page, and there's even a LinkedIn group that specializes in following the Mises Institute and Austrian economics. So we're out there. Come and get us and learn about Austrian economics and what your government is doing to financially repress you.
Well, thank you very much for joining us today, and I hope all of our listeners do check out the Mises Institute's website and some of the other things that they have across the web. So thank you once again, and hopefully we'll be able to talk to you again soon.
Thank you, Adam. Thank you, Daniel. I look forward to doing it again in the future.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Wake Up Call podcast.
If you would like to listen to more episodes, please subscribe, rate, and review the show on iTunes, or subscribe on Stitcher, and check out our website at wakeupcallpodcast.com.
There you will find show notes pages and comment sections dedicated to the show. You can also email us at contact@wakeupcallpodcast.com if you're interested in being interviewed for the show or have any other suggestions.
Thank you.